it has been a long time coming. Today, the Attorney-General's unveiled his plans for a religious discrimination bill. Now, it's not a Religious Freedom Act. There's a difference here. A Freedom Act like this would empower those of religious faith to say and do whatever they want in the name of their religion. Christian Porter's not gone that far. This is a Religious Discrimination Act. The shield, as he calls it, rather than the sword. It's aimed at protecting those of religious faith against discrimination on religious grounds. It aims to essentially echo or mirror race and sex discrimination acts with similar provisions. But this draft exposure bill, and it is only still a draft, there's formal consultations that will begin from next week before the final bill is brought to Parliament towards the end of the year. This draft bill does have one difference to some of those other anti-discrimination protections. There are exemptions here for religious institutions.
For example, it would not be discriminatory for an Islamic school to decline to employ Catholic teachers or vice versa. But this bill does not affect the current exemptions that exist for religious bodies within other discrimination acts at either a state or Commonwealth level.
So how would this new law affect a case like that of Israel Folau, whose contract was terminated by Rugby Australia after he posted what he called biblical teachings on Instagram and Twitter? That post suggested that hell awaits homosexuals and others. Well, this proposed law would give someone in Israel Folau's position some greater protection, but not complete protection. It also seeks to protect the right of the employer, Rugby Australia, for example, to, put in place restrictions on their employees, tweeting whatever they like, as long as they can show they're doing so to prevent financial harm to their organisation.
For a large employer, a rule that has the effect of restricting someone from making a statement of religious belief outside work is not to be considered reasonable unless that large employer can first show that the rule was necessary to avoid unjustifiable financial hardship to that employer. So, for instance, a large organisation in Rugby Australia's position might argue that its restrictive rule was necessary to protect its brand and so avoid unjustifiable corporate hardship, and was otherwise reasonable in all the circumstances. Someone in Mr Folau's position would likely argue the opposite, but this provision offers a procedure to engage a protection. Importantly, and I will stress this, no statement of belief in this context is reasonable if it is malicious or if it harasses, vilifies, incites hatred or violence or advocates for the commission of a serious criminal offence.
So the Folau tweet doesn't fall into that category of inciting violence, but what Christian Porter is saying there is there would be a stronger protection for people of religious faith to tweet that sort of thing, unless the employer can prove that they need to put a ban in place in their workplace because there's a potential financial harm to the organisation. Well, we spoke earlier to one of Christian Porter's colleagues, the Liberal Senator Concetta Fierravanti-Wells. She's got a couple of issues by the sounds of it with what's just been announced, wants to look at the detail because it's only just been released today. But for starters, she thinks people should be able to quote the Bible without any fear of being sacked by their employer. She also worries that the carve-out that's there for religious schools should also be extended to religious aged care facilities and religious hospitals when it comes to their right to be able to hire and fire, make decisions of employment based on religion, so that a Catholic aged care facility wouldn't have to hire an Islamic or Jewish staff member, for example. But most importantly, Concetta Fierravanti-Wells believes what we need is a Religious Freedom Act, not a Religious Discrimination Act.
I'm on the record as advocating a religious freedom legislation in accordance with our international obligations. Australians believe in freedom of speech, in freedom of thought, in freedom of conscience and in freedom of religion, and so that I've launched a petition to this effect, and I have to say that I'm receiving a lot of support in relation to this.
As Christian Porter argued today in that speech he gave at the Great Synagogue in Sydney to a whole range of religious leaders, you go down that path, it's the start of a Bill of Rights. There'd be demands for other freedom acts when it comes to all sorts of areas, and that would ultimately mean the courts deciding on how those rights are applied. The problem for Christian Porter is he's facing pressure from both ends on this. This is a balancing act. As you can hear, some within his party want him to go a whole lot further than he has. Others, however, question whether there is a need to do anything at all. Now, Labor's going to take a good look at what's been announced today. They're not rushing to judgment. Their complaints today are about the lack of consultation so far on this. They say they have not been consulted, other groups have not been consulted. They want to ensure there's plenty of time for consultation before this does come to Parliament. But on a specific point of concern, they are worried that this new federal religious discrimination bill would override state anti-discrimination laws, including those in Tasmania.
It's a surprising feature because Mr Porter ruled out interfering with state anti-discrimination laws, and apparently, I haven't examined the provision myself, but apparently what this bill does is to do just that. It does directly interfere with the Tasmanian anti-discrimination law.
And again, this is going to require further examination from Labor. They're going to have a good look at this. The process that follows from here is from next week, the formal consultations will commence on this exposure draft bill. That will include a series of roundtables with stakeholders, so religious groups, but also those who fear what this religious discrimination bill might mean for them. There'll no doubt be a parliamentary committee process to deal with this as well before we finally see a vote in Parliament. Whether that happens this year or early next year, we will see.